Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Prosperity Institute for our final event of the year. My name is Fred de Fossard and I am Director of Strategy here. I'm delighted to see such a full house at Prosperity Institute, even while Westminster's Christmas party season is now in full swing, though I expect some of you will make a dash to other watering holes after we conclude. Reflecting on the year at PI, briefly, we've hosted some of the most interesting and effective events in British politics this year. A fortnight ago, we hosted a day-long conference on the end of net zero and how to revive British industry, with speeches from Richard Tice from Reform UK, Graham Stringer from the Labour Party, Claire Coutinho and Andrew Griffith from the Tories, and many industry leaders. In October, the Institute's Lady Sarah Elliott convened two excellent Anglo-American discussions, one with speechwriter to Ronald Reagan, Peggy Noonan, to mark the centenary of Margaret Thatcher's birth, and a fascinating discussion on the roots of Anglo-American liberty with America First Policy Institute, themes I'm sure we will touch on this evening. And of course, in the summer, we announced our landmark paper on why and how to lead the ECHR, with Suella Braverman, Richard Tice, once again a regular in this room, and Lord Frost. So it has been an exciting year at the Institute, to say the least, and this evening the excitement will continue, I hope. We are here to talk about one of the worst innovations produced by Parliament in recent years, the Online Safety Act. In the summer, its latest provisions came into force, introducing age verification checks for online content, which the government believes could be harmful to children. Its effects have been immediate and widely criticised. Soon after these effects came to force, footage of British people were being arrested in Leeds while protesting against asylum seekers' hotel accommodation was censored on X for users who had not verified their age. Even worse, videos of a speech made in Parliament by Katie Lamb detailing the horrors of the rape gangs have also been blocked by these new rules. Speech which had been constitutionally protected from censor in Britain since the 1689 Bill of Rights is now finding itself censored online via age verification technology. And only today I've seen that posts on Substack, hardly a home of villainy and evil online, I'm sure you will agree, now being caught by age verification too. This follows previous interventions made under the Act, including Ofcom, the regulator responsible for the Act, demanding that all AI companies moderate and train their models to ensure AI safety, and volunteer-run forums being shut down because of the Act's rules around the moderation in comments and user posts. A particular favourite of mine, London Fixed Gear Cycling Forum, has shut down for this very reason. Although that website is full of nasty, nasty lefties, so maybe it's not too much. It is hard to overstate the significance of all of this. British people are being forced by the state to verify their age and hand over personal information to view political news about their own country. It is the sort of thing for which British diplomats, I imagine, might castigate third world or tyrannical governments for doing the same in their own jurisdictions, but there seems to be little awareness of this, of the danger of this in particular, among our own governing class. This has economic, trade, and diplomatic implications as well. The UK does have an open economy and one of the largest digital and technology markets in the world. This has been one of our recent successes. With such a digitised economy, and one with such deep ties to our friends over in the United States in particular, speech restrictions in the UK are not just an imposition on the British people. I believe they are also taking the form of a new type of trade barrier, and a sign to the wider world that the government wishes to regulate individual and consumer behaviour in their phones and on their computers even further. So it is a bad news for investment as well as a bad news for freedom of expression. When the Online Safety Act was making its way through Parliament under the previous Conservative government, there were sadly few voices opposing it. The Online Safety Bill then was passed with overwhelming cross-party support. Concerns raised by organisations like the Free Speech Union, represented here this evening, about the threat it posed to freedom of expression were waved away with vague reassurances by the then government. Don't worry, there won't be any mission creep. Meanwhile, the Labour Party wanted the laws to go even further, even faster, even deeper, and expand it to target speech and political dissent explicitly. And now we are in that brave new world. The Prime Minister said last summer he actually wants to strengthen the Online Safety Act in response to political demonstrations. You will also know that the purported reason that age verification checks were introduced online was to stop children viewing pornography or harmful content like that which induced them to commit suicide. I think this is a valid target for policy-based solutions, and I'm sure many people in this room do. The problem is that the definitions in the law are so poorly defined that a much broader category of information and content is captured by the Act. The Online Safety Act enforces a duty on tech platforms to prevent children of any age from encountering, by means of the service, primary priority content that is harmful to children. The use of a much broader list of content which the Act intends to remove muddies the water even further and expands the scope of the law much wider and into the territory of political speech. While this law had consensus from the political class, a new and insurgent political party has arrived to spoil the show and attack this consensus with vigour. This summer, Reform UK announced that it would repeal the Online Safety Act in full, with no equivocation. This has transformed the discussion, put actual repeal on the agenda, and restores some of the choice about the future. We have liberty and debate on one side, or censorship and consensus on the other. So, that is what we're here to examine this evening. As we are pressed for time and with such a packed schedule, I will introduce everyone now and we will progress to business on stage. Our first speaker this evening is Head of Policy for Reform UK, Zia Yusuf. Zia had led the charge against the Online Safety Act while at Reform. Calling for its repeal, he and Reform leader Nigel Farage are making the case not just for the restoration of free speech and political discussion online in Britain, but also for the type of digital regulation which will attract innovation and investment to the UK, ensuring the country can chart a path to prosperity in the digital realm. Following Zia, we will host a panel discussion on stage with Andreas Hellman from Americans for Tax Reform and Toby Young, Lord Young of Acton, the founder of the Free Speech Union. We will hear about how Americans for Tax Reform, great campaigners for low taxes and free markets, have also started to see the Online Safety Act as a trade barrier and an attack on US companies, and how the Free Speech Union continues to fight for liberty in the UK, as well as where we should draw the line on child protection. And our closing speaker, Sarah Rogers, Under Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy at the US State Department. It will be a privilege to hear from Sarah, recently appointed by the US Senate to the US government, who is on her first tour of business for the State Department, fighting for free speech in allied European nations, first here, then Italy and France, I believe. We will wrap up here around 8:30, hopefully before, and we'll return to the bar for a drink. We will try and squeeze in time for some Q&A at each session. I'm sure you'll be eager to answer questions from the floor. We will be recording this event. My colleague Angus is live streaming it here, and our cameras on the walls will be recording a longer form version, which we'll upload to YouTube so you can digest in longer time. First, a few words from Christopher Butler of the Tholos Foundation, who have kindly supported this event, before we turn to Zia. So, Chris.
Thank you, Fred. The Tholos Foundation is an organization that's based in Washington, D.C. with a worldwide footprint. The Tholos Foundation is named after the Tholos on the ancient Athenian Agora, where the members of the Athenian Senate would meet with members from the business community, with academics, and with philosophers over dinner to try to plot the best course forward for the city-state. We primarily work, let me mention also our partnership with Americans for Tax Reform. We run a meeting in Washington, D.C. called the Wednesday Meeting. We'd invite all of you to come by when you're in town. Please let me know. We're there every Wednesday from 10 to 11:30. We also have 47 meetings across the United States and 27 outside the U.S. But in the course of building these coalitions that bring together people that are economic conservatives with other types of conservatives, you might not be surprised that we're fans of Frank S. Meyer. And about this topic, Frank S. Meyer said, "The economic and spiritual aspects of man's nature are inextricably intertwined. Neither can be free unless both are free." Now, spiritual, referring to freedom of speech as a spiritual freedom might be a little bit strange or unusual at first, but I think that Frank S. Meyer would join me in putting freedom of speech into this category of the spiritual freedom. It's really deeply fundamental about who we are as human beings. And when psychologists look at the way the human mind works and develops, it's not able to achieve full growth until we develop those abilities and those manners of speech. And so just like some of our other more fundamental freedoms that we think about, like freedom of religion, for example, it really is fundamental to who we are as human beings. And in conjunction with economics, our common economic ancestor Adam Smith said that economic transactions themselves are just another form of rhetorical persuasion. So when we're talking about economics, or we're talking about freedom of speech, what we're talking about is two fundamental freedoms that make us who we are as human beings. And I think that's one reason that intervention outside of the borders, like we're thinking about today, and whether this is appropriate or not, I think we really need to put that in context of a fundamental human freedom, and not just consider this another thing like a particular tax on a particular kind of good or a sort of regulatory policy. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first panel.
Thank you very much, Chris. Zia.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. So look, I think the arguments here have been reasonably well litigated already, but let me remind everybody, again, it was a few months ago that me and Nigel announced at a press conference that a reformed government, one of the first things we would do is look to repeal the Online Safety Act. Why repeal and not amend? Well, having read how many people here have actually read the full act? Be honest. I'm not very honest about it. Right? I mean, I don't blame you. That's the way this sort of authoritarianism is usually smuggled in. Nobody agrees. I'm convinced most Tory MPs who voted for it did not read it either. But if you read it, you will come very quickly to the conclusion that if you believe this country should be one in which people have free speech, a country in which people are free to make satirical remarks, for example, that there's almost nothing that is savable inside this act. And we can go through some of the most alarming. We haven't got enough time to go through everything. We can go through some of the most alarming sections. Section 179, which outlaws somebody can be prosecuted for saying something that is quote false, that creates quote non-trivial psychological harm. I mean, who in this room is not guilty? And I get that every time I turn on Sky News or BBC News. They'll all be in jail. And then you've got Section 44. You've got Section 44, which allows a single minister to unilaterally order Ofcom to rewrite the rules, by which people can ultimately be prosecuted. Again, this is violating norms that we've had in this country for hundreds and hundreds of years. It means a singular minister can unilaterally change the rules, effectively change the law without proper parliamentary oversight. These are, I can scarcely believe this was voted through with such vigor. And in fact, to the degree there was opposition inside the Conservative Party, don't let them try to rewrite history. To the degree there was opposition, it was that it did not go far enough. That was most of the opposition. Those of you who would remember what little conversation that did happen about this. So almost nothing from the bill can be saved. And Fred gave us a whole raft of examples. I mean, look, if you're going to assess and judge legislation, then you can only assess it. You can't really assess legislation on its intention. That's not the way to assess legislation. We can only look at what is the result of that legislation. What are we actually seeing in terms of outcomes? And it was a speech about the rape gangs inside the House of Commons, which was supposed to be constitutionally protected. Isn't that ironic, by the way, that happens to now be the case when the whole bill was supposed to be about protecting children? To compound that, Elon Musk posted a transcript from a really harrowing transcript. That was why he tweeted it, from a court case involving a rape gang. That was censored by the Online Safety Act. Obviously, protests outside migrant hotels. Very suspiciously, there was an article reporting on the fact that there were no babies named Keir born in the UK last year. You decide if that's correct, but that is true. That is true. And so we have to ask ourselves why we've allowed ourselves to get into this situation. I think in no small part, A, it's because we have a culture where a lot of MPs don't even read bills anymore. B, the people leading the charge in many cases, frankly, have little to no understanding of technology. And I want to talk a little bit also about some of the other unintended consequences. And as a head of policy at Reform, we are as interested in repealing laws as we are, maybe even more so, than passing new ones. I think the country broadly has too many laws and the existing laws are not enforced, the ones that are worthwhile anyway. But we're always thinking about unintended consequences, right? We all know the phrase, path to hell and all of that stuff. It's paid with good intentions. But one of the things that has happened is we've seen VPN usage skyrocket in this country by any measurable data point. And I ask, well, this is not necessarily the best crowd to ask because you're clued up about this. How many of you are parents? Right, so that's about half. And how many of you have used your ISP's parental control systems at all? Yeah, so a decent number of you. How many of you are aware that if your kid is using a VPN, that it completely bypasses and circumvents those? Okay, so they're okay, fine. All of that was fine, except that last.
I said it was a very good crowd.
But you get my point. You get my point. And even when I talk to journalists from predominantly left-wing outlets, which these days is most journalists, that they are pretty shocked by that. And they say, well, how do I check that, right? So there are a lot of unintended consequences to legislation like this. Not also, once people are routinely using VPNs, you're already in pretty dangerous territory because however bad most of the internet might be, you haven't seen anything until you've got to the deepest, darkest parts of it. And now, by the way, and here's another clue that this legislation had not been thought through by anyone who knew what they were doing. Now you're hearing routinely Labour MPs briefing that they're considering banning VPNs. As if that was not an obvious, it was the most obvious thing in the world. It was 100% likely you were going to see a spike in VPN usage. And by the way, if we go down the road, if this country ends up banning VPNs, well, now we're in a very, very elite group of countries, as we know, right? Some of the most authoritarian countries in the world. So again, I say this with no joy or pleasure whatsoever. I think, your point, Fred, was appreciated earlier that, we said we'd repeal it, not because we ran focus groups or, launched into a 10-month process. It was crystal clear this thing needed to be repealed. People who reform, we're not in politics because we want a career in politics. We're in politics, we believe in things. And even though the general election is a long way off, we have reshaped the debate on this like we have on many other things. We feel very, very strongly about it. I'm glad and very grateful for the work of Fred and everybody here at Prosperity Institute and all of you for taking an interest in this. Likewise, Sarah. And we've obviously got friends in America who believe extraordinarily strongly about this issue. But make no mistake, many of the things that we take for granted in this country are under threat. I'm sad to say, we have jury trials now being taken away from many people. Elections are being cancelled routinely. And by the way, can you imagine a Prime Minister Farage? Can you imagine Nigel won a general election? The first thing he did was start cancelling elections, taking away jury trials. I mean, the entire civil service would basically grind to a halt, and half of London would enjoy protesting it. And yet, all of this sort of stuff is hand waved away. In fact, the insane argument from David Lammy is that it's actually in keeping with the spirit of Magna Carta that he's taking away. That was the argument he made. We've truly, Orwell himself would be lost for words. And so, look, where we stand on this is we need to repeal this awful act. But do we think there needs to be a concerted effort to protect children from true harms on the internet? Yes. One of the things we are exploring already, and we'll look to publish this in the coming months, is our technical solutions like zero knowledge proofs. Like fundamentally, this is a technology challenge, right? And if you don't understand technology deeply, e.g., you're taken aback that children are now using VPNs to bypass this law you passed, you should not be legislating on it. It's as simple as that. So that is where we will look. I also want to touch on things like digital ID. So when we talk about zero knowledge proof, we're not talking about digital ID there, right? And we're not talking about creating a centralized repository of your data. I mean, how many examples do we need, by the way, of the British government being insanely careless with data? Look at the Afghan leak, for example. I mean, if you actually delve into the details of that, if somebody had created an Excel document with the most sensitive names imaginable and started emailing it around. So there is pretty much 100% certainty if digital ID does come to pass, and it is currently now Labour policy, that we are sitting on an almighty data breach that could bring, frankly, again, I don't say this hyperbolically, I don't think it is hyperbole, bring the country to its knees. We are living in a new era, and this is probably the last thing I will say. Having built a tech company and been in politics now for about 18 months, one of the interesting things I find when I spend time in the House of Commons or talk to MPs, there's this sense that they live in their own little world and are totally unaware of everything else that is happening. Right? We're living in a fiercely competitive world, and the endless attempts to try to over-legislate in completely boneheaded ways the technology sector is making Britain not just uncompetitive, but actually utterly irrelevant. Some of you might remember the big argument that was had about advanced data protection from Apple. You're familiar with this, which is the highest level of encryption that Apple offer with iOS, that the government basically wanted a backdoor to, and said, yeah, we want the ability for somebody from the Home Office, where you would not even know that the government was accessing your messages. And this could be happening to anyone in this room, probably is, frankly, that the government is accessing your messages, accessing your photos and your videos. You would not even know about it. And Apple basically said, well, we're not giving you the backdoor, we'll just withdraw that service from the UK market completely. And that is what I'm worried about as well. We are living in an era where I think there's going to be enormous change in civilization generally over the next decade. I think Britain has an immense opportunity to play a leading role in that. It also has an opportunity to leave itself not just irrelevant, but potentially leave itself as a vassal state of the CCP. I think that is on the table sadly as an outcome if we can. And by the way, that is the door. That is the path Britain currently is on. And again, that might sound hyperbolic, but if you talk to people who are inside the AI space, who are looking at what Britain is doing, I mean, I could probably do another speech about what's happening with China and the extraordinary capitulation that this Labour government seems to make time and again to China. We can go into potentially the reasons for that. But I say all of this because this country's at a fork in the road, and it's going to take very smart, high agency people like you to help prevent the worst outcomes from happening. All right. Thank you very much.
I think we have about 12 minutes or so for questions. I'll do a couple here, and then to the floor, where hopefully we will have a microphone around the audience. So you paint a very, very grave picture of the state right now, and I basically agree with it. What do you think it would take for the government to actually stop and reverse this trajectory right now?
Well, to start with, we need to repeal the Act. And again, I want to stress, we do agree that there are things that can be done legislatively to help protect children. Again, not without unintended consequences. We've got to look very carefully about that. I'm actually convinced that this current legislation makes children less safe. It just lulls people into a false sense of security. So we need to do that. But look, in the end, as Thomas Sowell said, often there are less solutions and more compromises that need to be made. And what are we going to prioritize as a country? And are we going to prioritize the idea that people should have free speech, and we need to try to protect that as much as possible? Or are we going to try to or is the government going to take the view that it wants to basically surveil everything on the internet? And then, by the way, the very people who will determine what is, this isn't even hate speech, by the way, this is a far lower legal threshold. This is non-trivial harm caused by something said that is false. Who gets to decide what is non-trivial harm, particularly, by the way, when jury trials are being taken away, right? And that's why you have to connect these two things. The notion that there will not be people in the dock who are going to be jailed without the right to be judged by their peers is for the birds. That is coming down the track. So we basically need to, I mean, the short answer to your question, as is so often the case, frankly, in British politics in recent years, is just literally do the opposite of what MPs have done in recent years.
Very true. Do you think the actions of, say, tech companies pulling services from the UK, there's always this dance of whether Wikipedia will deactivate in the UK following these regulations? Might that stop this government in its tracks, or would they just say tech is trying to bully the government?
Yeah, the problem with a lot of MPs now and politicians is there isn't really a sense of any form of reflection. There's no willingness to even look at data and say, well, maybe that didn't go as well as we thought, we're going to change it. In fact, it's the opposite. So I'll remind everyone, when we announced that we would repeal this act, Peter Kyle went on TV and announced that Nigel was on the side of the most famously notorious paedophile in the history of this country. That is the state of debate about this, right? They said you're on the side of Jimmy Savile, who, by the way, famously was not on the internet, right? That was the point. So unfortunately, that's the problem. I think you basically need, obviously I would say this, but obviously live it too, we need a reformed government, we need Nigel as our Prime Minister.
On the prospect of a reform government, if you were to implement a free speech bill, are there laws wider than the Online Safety Act in your targets for repeal?
Oh yeah, we are accumulating, as I said, probably the majority of our time is spent now accumulating laws to repeal as opposed to new laws to pass. And I think the country is way down by. Look, it's symptomatic that laws are not enforced properly, in part because there are too many. We are looking at, we've already talked about, for example, withdrawing from the ECHR, replacing with a British Bill of Rights, of which free speech will be a very important part. Obviously, we'll never have the same protections that Americans do because we don't have a written constitution, and whatever we pass, sadly, can be, we can't bind a future parliament, but we will do everything we can to try to give people as much confidence as possible that they can live as free citizens in the country, and and the threshold for jailing people for speech should be sky high, much higher than it is right now.
Speaking of jailing people, do you see the problems around free speech with the way the police are knocking on people's doors for infringements? Do you see that as a cultural problem with the police, or a sort of legal problem there existing in a bad system, or is it a bit of both?
A little bit from column A, a bit from column B. Yeah. But look, I always take the view that generally the way I look at things, and we try to look at things from a policy perspective of reform, is like, you can blame judges all you want and whinge about an activist judge. And it's not like there aren't some merits. Obviously, there's some great judges too, and it is important that there is an independent judiciary, but it's down to politicians to make the laws. And so, when we talked about our deportation plan, for example, as we drafted the legislation for Operation Restoring Justice, to basically clear the decks legislatively so we can actually get mass deportations going in the way that hasn't happened yet in this country. The acid test was there should not be a judge in the country who should be able to prevent these flights from taking off. And what I think often happens is politicians abdicate responsibility for making the laws and then just look to blame judges if they get the wrong decision. So I would make that same argument with regards to the police. We hear my inbox is full, so is Nigel's, lots of us at Reform. Our inboxes are full of police officers, serving police officers, former police officers. The serving ones say, please do not, don't mention my name to anyone, right, sadly. Who say, we're on, we really appreciate what you're doing. They feel totally unsupported by the police officers above them. They feel totally encumbered in terms of doing their job. They're worried that if they actually try to enforce the law, they'll be labelled and smeared as racist or an out of context video comes out that, by the way, not just causes them to lose their jobs, but like ruins their life. And so what's your risk reward if you're a police officer? You do the same thing, by the way, about our armed forces. This insane situation while most lethal warriors are being prosecuted. I mean, it's disgusting. And by the way, in my view, it's all deliberate too. So I think that you've got this weaponization of, I think the ECHR originally was well intended, like so many things. It's now being used to, in my view, look to neutralize, as I said, our most formidable fighting forces. So a lot of this stuff is connected. What we're going to look to do legislatively with the Reform government, if we're elected, is, as I said, clear the decks, try to get as much of this done in our first year as possible. And that will then, I hope, have a really significant impact, by the way, on how many and the quality of people who want to be police officers and want to serve in our special air service and special police service, right? These are all connected. I mean, right now, the best people are leaving those professions.
Absolutely right. So we're going to questions from the floor for a couple of minutes. Start with Eric Kaufman, just there.
Okay. Wonderful, Zia. You really enjoyed that. Eric Kaufman, University of Buckingham. Just a question about the institutions, which I think are going to be a major obstacle, even if you get the right laws.
Really, you think?
I'm in the university sector, so I see this closer. To what extent might we expect under a reform government a similar approach that some of what we see in the US, for example, a much more interventionist approach in the institutions? Because really what we see, and even with something like the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, universities are misinterpreting that, they're misinterpreting the Equality Act, they will do everything they can to essentially frustrate the spirit of the law. So how might you reform those institutions?
Yeah, it is very difficult because these institutions have been around a very, very long time. You're comparing Harvard and Cambridge, that's a valid comparison in terms of prestige, and culture is very, very difficult to change overnight. You can't just pass legislation and change culture. These are cultural issues. But we can set the tone. And we can make sure that, I will say, even as we speak, there are actually reform student unions at all of these universities going. Although, here's a funny data point for you. On May the 1st, will be quite a good day in terms of local elections. There was a ward in Durham where Reform got, I think, the highest, sort of 65, 66% or something. There was one ward where Reform scored 7%. Anyone want to guess? Just have a guess. That was actually the epicenter of Oxford University, where we scored 7%. Hopefully we do better next time. But look, I've been meeting people from vice chancellors and people from the universities. My sense is, and my hope actually, is that there will be less of an issue than there is in the United States. I think one of the other things that doesn't, also the UK, which I actually think is an advantage. I'm interested to hear what Sarah thinks about this, but one of the reasons why I think I'm optimistic actually about what Britain can do in many ways is because we don't have this sort of federal versus state dichotomy, where there's just a culture of, if it's the red team in the White House and the blue team in the state, there's always this ongoing battle. You're already starting to see that with AI and things like that. Now, obviously, America is the world number one, and it's going to be very difficult to catch up. But I will say we have the ability to be much more nimble on these matters. And broadly so far, universities have been quite willing to engage. Now, what I will say that we've also been open that we think too many people go to university in this country. What that does is devalue these degrees. You look at what's happening in junior employment now. I don't think it's sustainable for 50% of the population of our young people to go to university, come out with enormous amounts of debt, and then be competing with ChatGPT and a senior for a job. I mean, that's already starting to happen. We have to see how it shakes out. But they don't like hearing that message. But we're going to be pretty consistent about this stuff. We think we need more young people going to trades. And on the flip side, for our best universities, we want to triple and quadruple down on those strengths.
Excellent. Questions? More questions? Over there.
Hi, Zia. I'm Ben Kingsley from Usford End, the advocacy group. I think probably everyone here agrees the Online Safety Act's been pretty disastrous from a free speech perspective, but it's also been disastrous from a child protection perspective. It's done very little of what we were told it was going to do to keep our children safe. And I think, although everyone in this room doubtless is sold on your commitment to free speech, I think to carry the country with you, you may also need to persuade people of your commitment to protecting children. Could you say a little bit more about Reform's commitment to protecting children and how, in principle, we might go about doing that?
Yeah, and again, that's actually one reason why we said we'd repeal the Act, because we're going to have to start again as far as we're concerned. As I said, my view is that the Act makes children less safe, however anyone would define that term. I think the path forward is some sort of mechanism that is much more precise, certainly has none of this nonsense about allowing ministers to rewrite, to make Ofcom rewrite the code unilaterally and all of this other stuff. That, again, you've got to just look at the actual results of the Act. So all I can say on that front is it's something that is important to Nigel, it's important to me, it's important to everyone at Reform. We're clear-eyed about it being a problem. I'm not going to write that policy on stage with you now, but as I said, broadly, this is a technical problem. This is a technology problem. It's not a problem of intent, which is what I think ended up why there was a 200-page document at the end. We've got to find a way to ensure that we can protect children from truly harmful content, whether that's self-harm. By the way, the other really dark thing that's happened, which touches on everything that we talked about in terms of themes, is this idea, and Labour boast about it. Peter Carr was boasting about it on TV. They can jail tech bosses if they fall foul of any number of these rules, as if that's like a really cool thing. And again, that is a big problem, that what ends up happening is this highly emotive argument is made. Literally, the sort of the Simpsons meme, where actually, will somebody think of the children? And what that does is it completely does the opposite of anyone who is well-intended and is embarking on this process should want, right? It means you're not taking the subject matter seriously. If they were taking the subject matter seriously, they would be responding substantively to the very valid criticism that has come out since the bill. What have they done? Instead, what they've done is basically say that if you're not in favour of everything they've announced, you're on the side of paedophiles. So our solution, which we will announce in the coming months, will be something much more targeted that ensures that it is only about protecting children and not about squashing political dissent.
Pretty much final question for this session, in the second row. Lady in the second row here, Francis, please.
Hello, thank you so much. So kind of related to the university question that has been posed, I go to the University of Edinburgh. I'm in my final year there, and we just recently established a Reform UK Society there.
There you go.
And but it's been, the response has been incredibly hostile. Basically, all other societies have been boycotting us, and there's no invitations to any events or whatsoever. Do you have any word of advice for students and young people who genuinely feel like there are going to be very dire consequences for our future and careers, or getting jobs because of the opinions we hold currently?
Join the Free Speech Union.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. I think there's two parts to that answer. One, I'll come back to sort of future career prospects in a minute, but in terms of the here and now, just be a happy warrior, basically. Don't rise to it. There's nothing there. And by the way, that's something I think we can all learn from Charlie Kirk. Something I took away from that. And I think that's one reason why he was so formidable. He was so charming. He was very level-headed. He always took on the arguments. And here's the thing. And again, I would say this, but in the end, certainly when you're up against that level of hostility, those are the far left elements. Logic is not on their side, which is why they get very emotional. That's why they can only appeal to emotion. And don't take any of it personally. And know actually what you're doing is vitally important, right? It has meaning and substance way above and beyond what you might think in that particular moment. And it's really important. I appreciate it, and Nigel appreciates it. In terms of future career prospects, look, I think there are many people in this country. I mean, Reform is supported by a third of the country. The Conservatives have more support beyond that. There are many people in this country who are not going to look negatively on it at all. If anything, actually, they might look quite positively. But they're just not going to go on LinkedIn and post about it. It's really funny. People say that if Reform content goes up on LinkedIn, it gets enormous numbers of impressions, but no likes. LinkedIn, maybe that's what we'll do. Legislature buys likes on LinkedIn. Our accounts go through. So again, I wouldn't worry. Well, it's easy for me to say don't worry because I totally understand it, and it is a concern. I get that. Will there be people who look at that and say, no, I don't want those people in my company? That probably will happen. You've got to ask yourself, what is life for? What are your priorities in life? I mean, there are many people who I came across in the corporate world who basically would go out and advocate things that were totally antithetical to 180 degrees to what they actually believed in, hated what they were having to do, and no matter how much money they make, I don't think they'll ever be happy. So,
absolutely right, Zia Yusuf. Thank you very much for a lovely. Introduce our second session of the evening. So could I please be joined on stage by Andreas Hellman from Americans for Tax Reform and Lord Young, Toby Young, founder of the Free Speech Union. So what I think we should do here is, first of all, I'd like to reflect on the points made by Zia from Reform about the reforms of the free speech agenda. And also the situation that we face today. Obviously, Toby can bring an excellent perspective as a British politician, British journalist, British activist, and Andreas perhaps from the vantage from the United States. But also, you are American, but as your name is clear, you are also German, so you can provide a European perspective too, where I assure the audience things are actually far worse there than they are here, so we can breathe a sigh of relief. Toby, why don't you
Well, I can talk a bit about the efforts of the Free Speech Union and some other free speech advocacy groups to ameliorate some of the worst aspects of the online safety bill that was going through Parliament. And we were clearly doing our best to try and improve the bill. And the chances of killing it, even under the Conservative government, were pretty remote. We did make a few changes. I remember some officials at DCMS trying to fob us off by telling that there would be in the bill a clause saying that online platforms had to have regard for free speech before removing content. And when I told a sort of wise old MP this, he burst out laughing and said that officials always try and fob you off by saying, well, we'll include a have regard for duty, which is the lowest duty you can possibly have in a kind of league table of legal duties. So we lobbied extremely hard for months about that, and we got it bumped up to particular regard. It's on the bottom. It's one above the bottom when it comes to the league table of legal duties. I don't think there's much evidence of the big online platforms having particular regard for free speech before deciding to remove content. So I can't claim that was a great victory. Another victory was we managed to, I think, we were one of several lobbying for the inclusion of additional protections for content of democratic importance and journalistic content. So the idea is there's a slightly higher bar before social media companies feel obliged for fear of being sued for what 10% of their annual turnover or 18 million, whichever is the higher, by Ofcom for not removing content. There's a slightly higher bar. They have slightly more latitude when it comes to content of democratic importance and journalistic content, although there is a sting in the tail in the latter, because journalistic content is content produced by recognised news publishers, and there isn't actually a register in the Act of recognised news publishers. We'll sort of that, but it's a small step, I think, to produce now a register of recognised news publishers whose journalists can enjoy this special protection. But in any case, it's academic because those protections, only Category 1 providers are obliged to think twice before removing content of democratic importance or journalistic content, and Ofcom still hasn't got around. What is it? The DCIT now still hasn't got around to classifying which providers are Category 1 and which providers aren't. And until they've actually undertaken that classification process, I believe Ofcom is currently consulting about it, those protections won't kick in. So for the time being, they're absolutely meaningless. The only really meaningful concession we got was we did, I think, we were one of several groups who persuaded the government to remove the clause in the bill which would have allowed then the Secretary of State of DCMS, now the Secretary of State of DCIT, Peter Kyle, to draw up a list of legal but harmful content which Ofcom had to force social media platforms to remove as a matter of priority. And we thought that was a hostage to fortune. The Conservatives, believe it or not, aren't going to be in power forever. What if David Lammy is the Secretary of State in the relevant department, just draw up a list of content that Ofcom then had to remove as a matter of priority. So they did take out that clause, but it's still a clause saying that Ofcom must force social media companies to remove legal but harmful content for children is still in the bill. And that takes us, I guess, to age verification. So the age verification regime, I think, kicked in July. And what we feared might happen did happen, which is we were concerned that the big social media platforms, particularly Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, would age-gate right-wing content, but not age-gate left-wing content. And the reason we were suspicious that that's what would happen is because a publication called The Conservative Woman, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, maybe even written for,
A robust publication.
a robust right-of-centre conservative publication. It found that it was blocked on various mobile phone companies like Orange and Vodafone, and blocked as a matter of default if you had the safety setting activated, which it was activated by default, saying that the only content you wanted to see on the browser on your phone was content that was suitable for people of all ages. And it turned out that these mobile phone companies had outsourced the age classification of content to the British Board of Film Classification, used to be called the British Board of Film Censorship, and they had classified the content in The Conservative Woman as only suitable for adults. So unless you knew how to get into the default settings of your mobile, if you're on Vodafone or Orange, you couldn't actually access The Conservative Woman. So well, this is clearly what's going to happen, right? And that is what happened, as I think you pointed out. A Katie Lamb speech in the House of Commons was age-gated. You had to prove you were 18 before you could be exposed to that potentially harmful content. Not a single speech by any of the Gaza supporting independents, for instance, has been age-gated. Any content that seemed to support an anti-immigration narrative, even footage, I think, as you said, of an anti-immigration protest in Leeds was age-gated. None of the pro-Palestinian protests have been age-gated. So that fear materialized, and I'm not sure what we could do about it. We fought hard to try and improve the bill, and we thought we had won a number of victories, but it turns out they were all pretty hollow victories. And just finally, on the legal but harmful for adults point, that certainly hasn't been abandoned. So Ofcom is currently consulting about removing legal but harmful content if it's misogynistic, for instance, if it poses a threat to women and girls, even if it's legal. They encourage all kinds of left-wing lobby groups, activists to respond to those consultations. We're a voice in the wilderness saying, no, please don't censor this stuff. So inevitably, there's going to be a kind of creep of removal of legal but harmful for adults coming out of this range.
Asymmetric regulation and also asymmetric evidence, the way it all comes in. So we've had a very good perspective from a British activist here, someone who is also now parliamentarian. I'd love to return to what rumblings you think might happen being Parliament on going further on this law in a minute. But to go to across the Atlantic, Andreas, please, could you give us an indication of your perspective as an American, but also as sort of political activist, what you do with Americans to tax reform, and what the impression is in your ecosystem in conservative America has been of this law?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for setting up the event and for talking about this important issue. I myself was very, very surprised, right? Like you would sometimes, it pops up in your news and you're like, here, oh, someone was arrested for this or that, and you click on it and you read half the article and you read the quote, what this person was arrested for, and you read it again and again and again, and you come to the conclusion, how is this happening? And so I feel like the first time this pops up, like many people were just surprised. If you remember, just to draw the comparison, because I feel like this is not just like a British problem, I feel like it's like a problem on the continent of Europe as well. I don't know how many of you in the room have watched the 60 Minutes episode about the German government going after online posts. It was widely shared, a lot of people saw it. A lot of Americans were very, very surprised that like the government knocks on your door at 6 a.m. because you posted a comment under an official government politician's account on X, and they come for you and they actually bring you to trial, and you actually not only get charged but you also get convicted. There's jail time for this, and so I feel like this happens in Germany the same way it happens here. The difference is that Germany is using the regular criminal code for this, and here we have the dedicated Online Safety Act for this. And the other surprise I have is, and I'm glad that this was brought up, I guess, earlier, why did not more people ask, like, how effective is this law? Like, everyone is talking about the intent of this law, and I think everyone in the room can agree, like, I have kids, most of us have kids, like, we want to keep our kids safe, we don't want them to access explicit content online, but the responsibility, first and foremost, I guess, would be with the parents. And I have to say, we have a lot of tools already to make sure that there's no exposure to that content. You have in-app controls, parental controls, you have that even for the device. You have, you talked about VPNs before. You can stop those VPNs actually in your router settings if you want as well. So there's like a hard way to do this as well. So there's lots of ways to keep your own kids safe, but instead, I feel like no one is really talking about that this law is actually not targeting this problem, rather creating a lot of other problems. And the question really is, for me, maybe this was the intended use of this law in the first place. Because otherwise, clearly people who supported this law would come up and say, well, this is not working. Oh my God, what are we going to do now? Because like we had a clear intent, we wanted to protect the children. It's not working. We have to come up with something new. But instead, they just like let it go, and everyone seems to ignore all these articles that are coming out. And it reaches a point that people who come to Britain, at least they think about when they land in Heathrow, oh my God, I really hope I didn't tweet anything 3 or 4 or 5 years ago that under UK law would be a criminal offense, but maybe under US law it's absolutely protected, or even in a different country would be protected. And this has a wide effect that I feel like it is very important. I'm very grateful for reform to take this on, to get rid of this and spread the news that this is not Britain. This is not right, and it obviously has an effect on trade as well. And while usually, as a free trader, I wouldn't want to commingle like internal domestic policy issues with like a trade deal, and a good reason for that is, for example, all these failed trade deals that the EU tried to put in place because they tried to mingle in climate action and like carbon fees and
we tried to do that with our failed trade negotiations with America in 2020.
Yes.
And American trade negotiators were rather shocked. We were asking them to make net zero.
Right. So usually these trade deals will benefit both sides, quickly fall apart if you try to put domestic goals in there that the other partner probably doesn't care about that much. But in this case, there are many good reasons why we should engage and why it should be, I guess, like it is a barrier to trade and why we should talk about it. One is obviously, and you mentioned this before, 10% fine on turnover, global turnover. That is a big argument for U.S. businesses to get engaged, and they don't like that. They especially don't like this because for the last decade they have been the prime target from everything that's coming out of Europe. We had the digital tax that started in France and the European Union. We had Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, which is like a moderate version of the Online Safety Act, European Union wide. We had the DMCC. We still have the British DST in place that is collecting 800 million in revenue just last year. And so if you put all these things together, all these fines, all these special taxes, and compliance costs, it is a huge burden to trade, and it is a huge problem for market access for U.S. businesses. So that is, I guess, the first argument. The second one is free speech is a fundamental human right, and we should care about this. And whenever there's an opportunity to promote free speech or secure someone else's right to free speech, I think it's worth engaging for sure. And then the last point that I would like to make, I'm very glad that Prosperity Institute was kind enough to provide us with the European version of the bottle, of these water bottles. Well, we have a Brussels effect, right? And I guess we don't want to have a London effect. And if laws like this become more popular and other governments around Europe and around the world feel like, wow, like this is great, like this is a great way, not to bring children, but it's a great way to like limit free speech. It's a great way to see what people do online, and if we don't like it because they don't like to vote the party that is in government, but they want to vote for the opposition, for example, we don't like this, it's a great tool to use it will spread. And we've seen this with DSTs, we've just seen it popping up in Brazil with the new version of the Digital Markets Act that they put into place. And so this is what happens if you do this. Like you end up not actually voting for this, but it spreads and you still have it. Like you don't have a law in place that tells you, or your bottle manufacturer, that you have to have the cap attached, but you still have it because it still spreads. And that is also a danger in itself. Like you want to contain these policies because eventually they will pop up elsewhere. And so it's good to start at the source.
Absolutely right. I think the point about the way these regulations target big tech companies is interesting. Shank Singham, who used to work here in the past, has developed a very good theory called anti-competitive market distortions. It's not the catchiest of terms, but when you think it through, it's a very good way of talking about regulatory barriers to trade as well as tariffs. And Zia Talks and Toby both mentioned the fact that there are exemptions for newspaper publishers.
Of course.
And that's one of the things that if one of these truths will get revealed, that newspaper publishers don't really like the tech industry for economic reasons, many reasons. And these regulations do end up benefiting their interests and do become an anti-competitive market distortion. Toby, before we go to the floor in a second, you are in Parliament at the moment. Do you get any rumblings about where things might go on free speech throughout the course of this Parliament? How things go?
I'm going to take a wild guess and say it's probably good for us. There was actually an interesting discussion yesterday in the House of Commons, the House of Lords, about David Lammy's announcement with respect to jury trials, and part of the Home Office Minister was trying to make as best a fish she could of defending these reforms. And one of the arguments she made was that, I'm not making this up, is that judges and magistrates have received diversity training, whereas juries haven't. So in some ways that makes them more suitable judges of guilt or innocence. Pretty shocking. And in the same day, there was a discussion about an amendment that Stuart Jackson and Claire Fox had tabled to the sentencing bill, in which they wanted courts within 12 months of convicting someone to reveal their ethnicity, nationality, where they were born, their immigration status. The police temporarily, on an interim basis in England and Wales, started to reveal some, but not all of that information for people accused of the most serious offences. And they're currently consulting the National Council of Chief Constables is going to be consulting about whether to keep that interim affair arrangement in place, and about 60 left-wing charities are petitioning them to immediately stop disclosure. And one of the arguments made by the Lib Dem Home Affairs spokesman was, well, the problem with the courts releasing this kind of demographic data is that it could fuel populism. It could fuel support for populist parties. It's like nothing to do with the fact that, you know, illegals are committing a disproportionate number of crimes fueling the rise in support. No, it's just the fact that people are being told about this that's fueling populism. And I think, but that I think gives us an insight into the mindset of the censors, of people who want to suppress information and designate information that seems to support populist, anti-immigration, anti-net zero narratives as harmful, as dangerous, as a threat to democracy. This, I think, is the kind of the reason we've seen the kind of metastasizing of internet social media regulation across the English-speaking world, across the EU, in Brazil. It's all fueled by a fear of populism. And they think the only way to preserve the kind of faltering grip on power of these sclerotic regimes is to suppress dissent. They genuinely believe that if they kill the messenger, if they stop people talking about the level of crimes committed by illegals, that will shoot reform's fox. That will shoot the fox of the AfD in Germany. They will shoot the fox of the National Front in France. And the curious thing is that suppression of these heretical ideas, however energetically, however zealously they go about it, is having the opposite of its intended effect. Yeah. I mean, this is a lesson that Louis Brandeis, the celebrated Supreme Court Justice, tried to convey in a famous Supreme Court case, a judgment, I think in 1919, in which he said famously, the best remedy for false and misleading speech is not enforced silence, but more and better speech. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. This was the counter-speech doctrine. If you want to defend your ideas, if you believe in the public policies you're advocating for, get out there in the public square and make your best efforts to defend them, because suppressing challenges doesn't work. And a really good case in point is Weimar Germany. So Weimar Germany was one of the first countries to pass laws prohibiting hate speech. Various leaders of the Nazi Party were banned from speaking in public in numerous German states. Publishers of Nazi newspapers were, in some cases, imprisoned. And it didn't stop the rise of the Nazi Party. It didn't stop the Nazis effectively being the largest single party in the election in 1932. So suppression doesn't work. Censorship doesn't work. It often has the opposite of its intended effect. If their goal is to prop up these decaying, sclerotic regimes, they're going about it in precisely the wrong way, which begs the question, should we tell them, Zia? Should we actually, this shit isn't working. You're devoting all your energy in the wrong place. It's actually just fueling support for parties like before. Maybe we should just let them carry on, because it's not only ineffective, I think it's actually counterproductive. I suppose as a defender of free speech, I have to stand up for the counter-speech doctrine and feel obliged to point out that this, what they're trying to do as a way of trying to protect democracy from the spectre of populism is completely counterproductive.
Of course, when we've given powers to do this regulation to Ofcom, do you think Ofcom is even halfway capable of regulating speech in the way it hopes to? I mean, I doubt it has any ability to keep pace with technological advancement.
Well, it's certainly on a hiring spree. It's
Lots of people have got sacked from the Twitter trust and safety team, I think, have made their way over there.
Yeah, I mean, I have no confidence in regulators to understand these sectors they're supposed to be regulating, or act in the best interests of those sectors, or indeed the public who they purport to be acting on behalf of. Regulators, by their nature, are kind of members of the educated, liberal, metropolitan elite, with all the inevitable political biases that brings with it. I mean, I'm not sure that everything they do is conscious. I mean, I think if anyone's in need of unconscious bias training, it's Ofcom staff. Nevertheless, I think it's. I mean, of course, if you empower a regulator with close political oversight to force social media companies to remove content, it's just they're never going to be able to do it in a politically impartial way.
Mhm.
It's absolutely inevitable that their political biases are going to creep in, and if they are of a left-wing bent, then of course that's going to be the tenor of their regulation. I just think that's completely unavoidable.
I think it's a very fair point. It's a warning often to many people on the right to think if only we have our people in these regulators, everything will be fine.
Yeah.
The sort of the drift of these things is almost always this outcome. Before I go to the floor, what came to mind was debanking, which is an issue which affects British people, American people, European people. I think, Toby, you've had various PayPal accounts cancelled over the years. The Competitive Enterprise Institute, an American think tank, has done great work on a thing called Operation Choke Point, where the US government basically debanked undesirables. That seems to have stopped for now, but Andreas, do you think that this remains a threat in the United States? Are we in a sort of welcome pause because of the current government? So would it change with a different party in power?
Well, I think it's definitely on pause now. You just don't know what the future brings. We've seen in the past what could happen, and I think, unfortunately, the way I look at the Democratic Party, I do think that they're just like in like a spiral of more radicalizing themselves. So I don't think that there is at some point going to be a stop where they sit together and say, well, we took it too far. Let's try to go back to the middle and actually like address problems of the people and try to find common ground. I think it's just getting more and more extreme, and you can see that also like who they put in the first row right now, and it's not the Hillary Clintons or even Barack Obamas anymore. You have people like AOC. You have many others that are on many different issues, very radicalized. And so yes, I do think that is the case. But hopefully we continue to have Republican governments for the foreseeable future. I certainly wish that for myself and for my family and my kids. So and I'm very grateful. I wanted to mention this when the Vice President J.D. Vance gave a speech in Munich at the Munich Security Conference. I do feel like many Europeans were very upset, and it wasn't well received from the heads of state that were there in Munich. And I think the reason for that was because they heard like an accurate description of the problems that they create and the policy failings that they're responsible for. And I do think that was very helpful because it brought certain topics on the agenda that you couldn't talk about anymore. Whether that's illegal migration, whether that's freedom of speech, people getting arrested for making a sarcastic tweet, things like that. Or just people that take the right that they have to vote for the party that they want.
Mm.
And in this case, it was in Germany, it was the AfD where it started that people like had to, they lost their job because they probably expressed that they liked certain things from that party, from the program, or they were a member, and it continued on. And I think it was sort of not allowed to discuss this anymore. And with that speech, he brought all these topics back on the agenda, and it couldn't be ignored. And so I feel like that shows like how powerful it is if the U.S. government engages on these topics. And I myself am very grateful for it because I'm German American, so I deeply care about both the European Union, Germany, UK, and also the US.
We'll hear from the US government directly in a few minutes. It'll be very exciting. Before we wrap up this session, does anyone in the audience have questions for Andreas or Toby? Jack, in the second row, just.
Thank you, Jack Hadfield. So, as someone who's recently turned 29, I've come one of the first generations to kind of really grow up on this sort of free-flowing internet, and I definitely saw some horrible things that I should not have seen as a young teenager. But at the same time, I think with that free-flowing information, that allowed me to become someone who's now more on the right. I'm back reform, and I think that what I've seen is that like a recent poll had young white British men, I think 1625, 50% of them are now supporting reform. So where can we kind of strike the balance between making sure that kids genuinely don't see actual legitimate harmful content online, but also make sure that it's not completely restricted again what they can see, so that, for example, would counteract what their woke teachers might be saying. And if we talk about way you want to strike that balance, is it something that should be done at a governmental public policy level, or potentially like more up to the parents?
I've got a radical solution. I've come around to the idea of just banning smartphones outright for under 16-year-olds, and then lowering the that way you'd effectively have an age gate of 16, and putting the age gate at 18 whilst at the same time in the next breath saying you're going to lower the voting age to 60 is absolutely insane. How can that possibly be justified? But I think, at first I was slightly suspicious of efforts to ban mobiles for kids under 16, thinking it was pretty at odds with my libertarian philosophy. But actually, I think it would mean that Ofcom's excuses for censoring content would be much reduced. You don't have to worry about content that's harmful to kids, because it's now illegal for children under the age of 16 to possess mobile phones, to go on social media. I think that could paradoxically produce a kind of huge tide of liberation in social media for the rest of us.
Andreas, what do you think? Is there a movement to ban phones in schools in America?
Well, let me, as a parent who currently struggles with limits to general screen time, I don't think that there is a way that you have like a 15-year-old in front of you and you can just ban it. Well, like they will find ways. Like we all found ways to do things that were not allowed at the time when we were like 16, 17, or 18. And I think the same will be true if you just like ban the phones. The phones are still there, right? So like they would find ways to do that. So that's number one.
Australia is experimenting with this policy. We'll see how it goes.
Number two, I do want kids to be able to be sufficient in like navigating the digital world. Like I didn't grow up like this. There's younger people that came after us. They just grow up with like phones in their hand, I guess, and like they're much better at navigating this world than we will ever be. And I think what is important is that you just like put safeguards in place as a parent, that you use resources that you have on the device, on the app, in your home. And then there has to also be a level of trust between you and your children that, they don't do things that you tell them not to do, and you also have other safeguards in place, but I wouldn't ban it. Like, I feel like that would be counterproductive. You want them to be able to use the phone. You want them to be like an experienced user of like new technology. You don't want them to be like set back and then they start with 16. I just feel like, and also I feel like it just couldn't be done. Like they would just find their ways, and then you'd be totally out of the conversation, because then it would be illegal and they would know it and they would not do it with you.
Very good. Any other questions from the floor? There's a hand towards the back.
Thank you, Rory Broomfield, a newly paid up member of the Free Speech Union.
Bravo.
And I say this because I can imagine a whole raft of people coming to the Free Speech Union, given this dystopian legislative agenda of this government. And the question to you, Toby, is, are you amassing a group of lawyers? I don't know what the collective noun is for a group of lawyers, but nonetheless, are you amassing a group of lawyers and or other professionals to fight and engage and free a number of people who are going to be in the future, very near future, under the cosh, given the legislative agenda of this government?
The short answer is yes. Actually, I had coffee this morning with Kevin Roberts, the head of Heritage, and he told me that one of the reasons Project 25 was so thorough and proved to be such an effective blueprint is that they had 1,000 attorneys working on it pro bono. There's a lesson there. But we have a legal advisory council of about 50 lawyers. We have now, I think, 5 lawyers on staff, and we hire external law firms all the time. We started the Free Speech Union in February 2020. We've now fought over 5,100 cases. We've been successful about 80% of the time. And many of those cases, a significant minority, have been legal cases. More and more often now, we're finding that the companies we take on, we send them a really aggressive threatening letter, or have one of the law firms we work regularly with send a company a really threatening letter, and they cave. So recently, for instance, a well-known supermarket chain sacked a cleaner who'd been working there for 37 years because she objected to a manager about the new policy of forcing women to share women's lavatories with biological men. We threatened them with a lawsuit. We helped the woman file a claim in the employment tribunal. We were gearing up to publicize this and publicly embarrass the company. They settled almost immediately for 100 grand, which was, and it's not unusual these days to get that sort of result. So we're winning some of these battles. It often feels like, I'm a member of the Fellowship of the Ring, defending, a castle, and just you slay one lot of orcs who just come over the ridge, and you think, well, hey, time to break out the mead, and then another shitload of orcs are just coming straight at you. So, it's whack-a-mole, but yeah, we do rely on orcs.
Marvellous. It is whack-a-mole indeed. Let's do final question from Alison just there.
Alison Pierce from the Daily Telegraph. I just personally, and for everyone in the room, I just like to say to our American friends from across the pond, we are hugely grateful for your interventions, particularly J.D. Vance in our benighted Stasi island, really. It is so shameful that the home of Magna Carta has come to this, but we are so thrilled that the colony that broke away is helping us out. I just wanted to ask Toby, huge fan of the amazing Free Speech Union. We've seen lots of cases, Toby, haven't we? We've just seen, actually earlier in the year, an ex-Marine, Jamie Michael, who was arrested, held for 17 days, not bailed, for a Facebook video in which he advocated peaceful protest against illegal migrants and their threat to women and children, and a marvellous jury in my part of South Wales discharged Jamie in 17 minutes. That's 1-7. Toby, do you think, first of all, do you think that this attempt by Lammy to deprive the British people of their right to trial by jury, do you think that has a more sinister undercurrent? And do you think that the British people now are wising up to what is being done to their vital freedoms?
You do get the impression that people are beginning to wake up. There's that great poem by Kipling about the Saxon. You can push him so far that ultimately there's going to be somewhere he's not willing to be pushed. And it does feel like that's where we've been pushed to. But on the Lammy proposals, I had tea earlier today with somebody who had been a special advisor in the Justice Department under the Conservatives, and she told me that senior officials in the department tried to persuade her minister to embrace these proposals. That was back in 2021. And the backlog is partly due to what happened during COVID. And this was in the immediate aftermath of that big backlog. Minister, the only way we can get through this backlog is if we suspend the right to trial by jury. So I think it's come from the deep state. I don't think Lammy's just a hapless puppet, as you might have guessed. One thing I said to the Home Office Minister in the Lords, who was trying to defend the policy, is that if Labour wants to reduce the delays and the backlogs in the Crown Courts, stop criminalising so much ordinary human behaviour. In the crime and policing bill, there are 65 new criminal offences alone. There's one new offence in the misnamed Hillsborough law, which makes it a criminal offence, punishable by up to 2 years in prison, to lie in public office. And that includes, there's no exemption for parliamentarians. So a politician who's caught lying can be prosecuted and sent to prison for 2 years. I mean, talk about clogging up the courts. I mean, the police and the Crown Courts are going to be absolutely up to their necks in vexatious prosecutions of God knows how many politicians, although of course it'll only be people on the right who are prosecuted, not Rachel Reeves, by the way.
So, bravo, it is 5-8. Toby, Andreas, thank you very much. We're going to take a 2-minute break because we need to change the microphones over, and then we'll hear from Sarah Rogers just before 8 o'clock. Toby, Andreas, thank you very much.
Everybody please, our final talk of the evening is starting right now. Everybody please. Thank you very much. So, thank you very much for staying with us throughout this evening. We've had a fascinating conversation with Zia, Andreas, and Toby. Now, for our final speaker, I'm delighted to introduce on her first official visit as a member of the US government, Under Secretary of State, Sarah Rogers. Sarah is at the US State Department. She was appointed to the US government this autumn. After the shutdown ended only very recently, she has got off to a flying start, and I'm delighted and privileged that her free speech around the world tour begins not just in Britain, but at Prosperity Institute. I don't know if this is the first time we've hosted someone, a serving official from the US government, but if it is, I'm delighted to be here to host Sarah speak. Before Sarah was appointed, she was a First Amendment campaigning lawyer, and I think was General Counsel for the National Rifle Association.
So a robust fighter for freedom that we can all admire. Sarah will speak, I think, for around a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, and then we'll do some Q&A until close, until everyone has had their fill. We will return to the bar for a drink. So without further ado, Sarah comes with the podium.
Thank you so much for hosting me, and it's a delight to see so many friends in the crowd, new and old. I am beginning my tenure as Undersecretary of State with a visit to the UK. I wish that I'd begun it at the Prosperity Institute, but in fact, this is my 5th or 6th engagement of the day since I got off the red eye this morning. But I could not be more thrilled to be with you. It's very easy to speak in a dire way about the Online Safety Act because the provisions of it are so tyrannical and absurd, but I thought I would offer a note of hope and optimism. As we know, and as the panels have touched upon, the Online Safety Act is not the worst, most censorious law in Britain. The Online Safety Act is not standing alone, and sometimes it's not the sole reason, and sometimes it is not even a contributing reason why you have comedians detained for tweets, why you have priests arrested for silent prayer, why you have grandmothers dragged out of their home for dissenting about gender ideology. There are a tangle of laws here that have these censorious effects. What the Online Safety Act did is it purported to codify, for purposes of extraterritorial enforcement, the requirement that companies on other countries' soil, including notably American soil, adhere to British hate speech, public order, and other censorious doctrines. And that, my friends, is a deal breaker. America is not going to do it. But we are delighted to see that others in Britain are opposing this law. How to repeal the Online Safety Act is for the British people to decide and for the British people to achieve, not for us to dictate. Why to repeal the Online Safety Act is self-evident. I'm here coming up on America's 250th anniversary. We'd like to call that the original Brexit. When our founders broke away from the old world and claimed new freedoms as citizens, not subjects. And the first of those freedoms was the First Amendment. I was not general counsel for the National Rifle Association, but I did represent the NRA in the first and only successful US Supreme Court case under the First Amendment, challenging the practice of debanking. And we won that case. And we didn't win that case just with a 6-3 conservative majority. We won that case with a unanimous 9-0 court. Because certain principles in American First Amendment law are so enshrined that even when you transgress them against the NRA, you transgress our Constitution. Now, Zia mentioned earlier that the legal framework here is a bit different. You don't have a written constitution the way we do. You have parliamentary supremacy. This has been exhilarating for me to think about actually as an American lawyer, because it means that although you don't have the same First Amendment bulwarks that we do, you have much more freedom if you win with a sufficient mandate to not only repeal the Online Safety Act, not only repeal other statutes that you might want to look at that sounds like Zia's looking at, but to replace it with whatever the British majority commands. And talking to good, thoughtful Brits today and on prior trips that I've taken in an unofficial capacity, it is clear that the average Brit wants to be a free person, wants to live in a free country. And that history corroborates that. Our 250 years of history together, it's true that we broke away, but you guys, you fought communism with us, you fought Hitler with us, you helped build the small L, classically liberal post-war order with us, and Brits don't want to be dragged out of their homes for posting jokes or memes. That's clear. I think, though, that there is a popular imperative, not only here, but in the United States, for what the Tory government maybe claims that it thought it was doing when it enacted this monstrosity, which is protecting children. Protecting children is a very important priority. We are interested in prosecuting digital technologies to do that. As I mentioned, zero knowledge proof, I think device level age verification tokens are also promising. My office is working with First Lady Melania Trump on an initiative called Fostering Our Future, where we actually challenge American and other tech companies to come forward with narrowly tailored technological solutions that actually help protect children, and will popularize those to leaders throughout the world in the hope that we can change the tech ecosystem for the better. over Thanksgiving, I went hiking with my 5-year-old nephew. And we passed a bush with some colorful berries on it, and he was chattering about whether they were safe to eat. And then he said, I know, and he asked for my phone. And I handed him my phone, and he asked me to open ChatGPT for him. And he took a picture of the berries, and he asked me to type in ask ChatGPT if these are safe to eat. And this is a 5-year-old, and there are 2 main takeaways from that cute story. One is that tech can be good for kids. It can open up the world educationally and otherwise. And 2 is that 5-year-old had to ask for my phone because he didn't have his own because he's 5. So protecting children is important. The American position is that the institution best equipped to do that ought to have the obligation and the responsibility and also the power to do that is the family, the parents. And so technological solutions that empower parents to do things like set up a child's phone, configure what kinds of content that phone should be allowed to access, I think are favored. And these are favored for another reason, by the way, which is that it's not invasive or chilling for most people's speech to be hit with the realization that, guess what? Your iPhone knows everything about you. It knows your credit card number. It knows where you walked and where you stayed overnight and your GPS coordinates. It certainly knows your age. And it would be pretty effortless for that phone to tell every app in the App Store, yes, I confirm this user's over 18. I think, cynically, one reason that legislators in the UK and the EU and other pro-censorship jurisdictions seem to be targeting these purported age verification gates at the platform level rather than the device level is that at the platform level you can accomplish a lot more censorship, because if Instagram or Google or TikTok can simply know which phone's accessing it are adults and give them an unlimited swath of adult content, the level of speech chilling is pretty minimal. But if instead you have to bypass a special interstitial or a special gate or upload your ID in order to do things like watch Katie Lamb's speech about grooming gangs, then the discourse is significantly more controlled. We had 200 years after the invention of the printing press to develop the institutions of modernity, and those were not a tranquil 200 years. When the structure of communication changes, the way people relate to each other changes, and our institutions go through shudders and shocks. We see this every time. We heard remarks earlier about the speech landscape in Weimar Germany and how, in fact, censorship did not contain Hitler. In fact, mid-century fascism was a mass ideology of the age of mass media. In that age, one speaker like me here could stand on a dais and address an undifferentiated mass of workers or World War I soldiers returning from the front who thought they'd been stabbed in the back. And that's how mass politics was mobilized. But we have now exited the age of mass media. We are in the age of mobile, social, local media, and now the age of AI. And the information environment has changed, not entirely for the better. There are very exciting innovations happening. I think what you learn when you look back at America's 250 years of history and the world history that preceded it is that in these moments of tumult, when we are learning how to communicate with each other in new ways, learning to process new kinds of images and new kinds of content that are bombarding our brains, there's always a temptation to censoriousness. There's always a temptation to ludditism. There is always a temptation to try to put that innovation back in the box. You can't, you'll fail. And the societies that resist that temptation, the societies that recognize that the best way out is through, and that more innovation, not less, is the real engine of economic growth, of better lives, and of access to true and rewarding content, those societies do better. And I'm very proud to be here on behalf of one of those societies. And I think the UK wants to be one of those societies too. I wanted to address the young lady from Edinburgh University who expressed concern that her conservative populist beliefs might hurt her job prospects. And you received some very constructive and very true responses from the panelists. They told you that you can keep your head down and focus on what's important. That's true, you can. And they told you that you can recognize how insane and unhinged these leftists are and take a kind of pride in it, and that's true, you can do that too. Another thing you can do is you can win the argument, and you're winning it now. If you look at the polls every day, the results that Reform UK is getting are proof positive that the British public are not content with this regime. When I first began supporting President Trump, it was 2015, I was an associate at a large law firm. Supporting President Trump could have hurt my job prospects then. And it certainly affected my job prospects now, because now I'm an Undersecretary of State. And now I get to sit here with the full and broader of the US government and stand for free speech, which is America's most famous freedom. And on our 250th anniversary, it's the one I'm most proud to carry forward and help you guys win back on your little island. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that address, Sarah. I'm going to ask a couple of questions on some of the policy points, and then we will turn to the floor for a few from there. Could you elaborate a little bit more for the audience's benefit about what tokens policy might look like? You and Zia have both mentioned that this is a technological problem in search of a technological solution. Are there these, do they exist already? Are they being developed in some parts of America or around the world?
So there are a few startups working on this. I haven't identified one that I want to promote, but that's something my office might consider. But this also, you could conceive of multiple providers of this. So when we talk about a zero-proof age verification token, what we're talking about is a source of a single discrete truth, which is that the user bearing this token, this cryptographic hash, is a unique adult who's over the age of 18. The service providing that information doesn't need to know anything else about you. And there are several ways to create this. So there are vendors in the United States that do this for use on like alcohol and gambling and now to some extent pornography websites, because some states have age-gated pornography. And what you do is you, the user, interact with this third-party service and you prove your age or your identity in some way. Now, in one model of this, you do in fact have to upload your driver's license, and there are just a lot of rigorous controls to like ensure that within seconds of your age being verified, your identifying information is destroyed. I think if we can get around even that requirement of like even that requirement of ID uploading, that's probably better. There are other services that rely on like AI heuristics. There are some that can take a selfie of your face, and while not retaining an image of your face, they can retain a cryptographic hash that contains like the numeric distance between your eyes, the numeric width of your mouth, and turn that into a number token that you can like carry with you to other websites and apps. But the idea of this would be that if regulators say we just want to make sure the user is over 18, okay, well here is a piece of proof that the user is over the age of 18. But what we're not going to do is require the user to upload his ID every time he wants to engage in political speech, for example. I know some of the solutions in this vein involve blockchain and are actually kind of perversely susceptible to like overregulation when people try to overregulate blockchain, which is another way that overregulation can actually harm child safety.
Very, very interesting. In your talk, you mentioned the AI landscape and how that's affecting political discussion. I was at a meeting around AI and copyright today, and one of the MPs present was talking about how they're going to have to accept the fact that all public figures will have AI-generated fake images about them, and maybe that's just going to be an inevitable fact of public life from here on in. Where should regulation on AI go? It's very, very interesting how the tech sector rode in behind Trump in 2024, partly as presumably as a sort of deregulatory agenda. Is that still the case? Where do you think should you land? How big is the AI safety movement or thinking in your administration?
So there are a couple of incarnations of AI safety. There are these people in Silicon Valley who really think that like there might be an omniscient, omnipotent AI. Some of them conceive of it as a basilisk or a lizard, and it will like travel back through time and torture you if you put it. This is a real thing that like AI scientists think. This is not my belief, unfortunately. And then there are, so that's the kind of like very theorized AI safety. And then there are sort of your more mundane kind of content moderator, hall monitor types who just don't want the AI emitting unapproved information or saying naughty words. And I think that is a more proximate regulatory challenge, the latter. I spoke with an American tech executive a few days before departing for the UK, and he casually mentioned to me that, although he doesn't expect it to happen, he could be arrested for a crime in the UK because his platform may or may not be compliant with the Online Safety Act, since it does not have a moderation policy for hate speech. And, this is, if you're a tech executive thinking about which sort of parties to align with and what political movements to support, the fact that there are tendencies in some countries, even in America, although they're not winning, which want to imprison you for like allowing a fairly standard range of First Amendment protected speech on your American First Amendment protected internet platform. That is a salient piece of information. Where should AI regulation go is a big multifaceted question. I think that right now, AIs are treated as agents of their operators, which means that whatever the AI does, if it emits a defamatory tweet, that defamation is attributed to the agent's principal.
So Grok is Elon Musk's fault specifically?
Well, not necessarily, because ViewHover is using the instance of Grok. But this is like this is a frontier, and I think it's the two routes to regulated are sort of regulation and tort liability, and different lawyers and policymakers have different intuitions about that. I think it really depends upon the context. But my office's view is, we want to win the AI race against China. This technology is the future from a national security and defense perspective. It is the future in a lot of business environments. Creatively, it's going to be very important. And whatever the next phase of the technology is, even if we decide we want to kind of impose a few guardrails on it, I think it's safe to say that we want Western countries to get there first. And that means not resorting to such a safetyist approach that the latest LLM is illegal to operate in this country, which, depending upon the interpretation of user-generated content, shareable content under the Online Safety Act, like ChatGPT may or may not be illegal to operate in this country. And you shouldn't have that uncertainty hanging over you as a user, let alone as an entrepreneur, especially because, as we know, Britain wants to advance in AI. And President Trump had a fantastically successful state visit here a few months ago, and one of the due outs of that visit was this AI collaboration agreement. And so this is something both of these countries want, and I think that it's not that AI should be totally unregulated forever, but we have to be really, really careful crowding this regulatory field with the kinds of hurdles and potential catastrophic liabilities that deter investors and deter executives and deter young entrepreneurs and scientists from building the next thing.
Absolutely right. So, some questions from the floor, please. Press Golfing.
Thank you. Michael Murphy. Earlier this year, Marco Rubio announced that you were considering a sanctions regime on people involved in censoring the speech of Americans. Just wondering how that's going, if you could potentially give us any names this evening. And I could definitely suggest some. And also, whether you have considered using the powers of, say, the Magnitsky Act, and whether you see this as something an initiative just to protect Americans, or as part of a broader effort to leverage protections for Europeans and British people as well. And just lastly, a technical question on how exactly you're monitoring whether American speech is being infringed in this country and in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, you don't need AI to monitor whether American speech is being infringed by the Online Safety Act, because we have an active piece of litigation in DC District Court between Ofcom and the website 4chan, which is an American website. 4chan has no operations in the UK, no employees in the UK, no specific context with the UK, but it's a website that someone from the UK could theoretically browse to. And so Ofcom has decided that it therefore has extraterritorial enforcement jurisdiction over that website. It doesn't matter that you're American, doesn't matter that you're protected by the First Amendment. If you're hosting hate speech, we get to sue you and fine you. Which is pretty imperialistic and extraordinary. So 4chan is not backing down, and there's legislation that may be before Congress soon to make sure that no penalties imposed by Ofcom are enforceable in the United States. I can't get ahead of the American legislature, but I hope that's something I'll consider. On sanctions, for those in the room who don't know, the Magnitsky Act is a very powerful tool we have in the United States to impose really thorough exclusion from financial institutions on an individual. So this was enacted after a lawyer named, can't remember his first name, but his last one was Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky was allegedly kind of tortured to death in a Russian prison after representing an American hedge fund in a dispute with the Russian government. And the goal of those sanctions was not just to sanction the country, but to find the individual oligarchs and others who'd been involved in these abuses and target them personally. My office spearheaded a successful effort earlier this year to impose Magnitsky sanctions on Judge Moraes in Brazil, who has led their censorship efforts there. And that certainly remains an option in our toolkit in countries other than Brazil, and I am constantly receiving and taking to heart suggested names.
We'll speak after.
Yeah. Question.
Kevin, your hand. Oh, sorry.
Sarah, hello, thank you for being here. So I'm Adam, I run a small organization called Open Justice, which has helped to publish and publicize many of the Grooming Gang transcripts. The Katie Lang speech has been mentioned a few times today, and we actually helped Katie with that speech. She quoted from some of the transcripts when she made it. She quoted, there was one part in particular that seemed to be very susceptible to censorship, where she quoted one of the defendants saying that they're here to fuck white girls, they're here to fuck the government, and they're here to take over. I've read a lot of these cases, and I've not found a single one where the prosecutors have enacted the legislation that we have to worsen sentencing if a crime is racially motivated. And there are hundreds of cases where this pattern is present. Now, the decision for this rests ultimately with the CPS, the prosecutors, and as Fred said before, I think we labor under the delusion that we can scrap Ofcom, we can replace the Attorney General, and we can, perhaps reform these institutions. So my question for you is this: we knew that the Trump admin has been frustrated in some of its efforts by prosecutors on crime, and particularly around immigration judges. What efforts has the Trump admin undertaken to reform these legal institutions? Are there any lessons that we, our incoming government here, might learn from them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I run this organization called Open Justice, and everyone should check it out and check out his Twitter feed. The transcripts are gruesome, but they're very important. So the Trump administration recently fired a batch of immigration judges, and we are actively looking to hire more. And I think because of your parliamentary supremacy, you are very flexible. If you win with a sufficient mandate and sufficient will, you can remake the judiciary however you want. Obviously, you want to maintain some legitimacy. You might choose to exercise like some degree of prudential caution about what you do, and I leave that to the Brits. But the other thing too is like if you've got potential criminal enhancements based on racial animus, you may decide to either repeal those or to provide some kind of additional guidance on how they're applied. But certainly, I think the composition of the judiciary is ultimately up to the public in a democracy, and the text of the laws that the judiciary is applying is ultimately up to the public in a democracy.
Absolutely right. Any other questions for Sarah from the audience? Surely we can squeeze one more.
Oh, let me while we're waiting for the next question. So as I mentioned earlier, that another kind of insidious prohibition of the OSA prohibits any information that might cause like negative emotions as long as the information is false. So litigating against censorship in the United States and then being part of an effort within the government to dismantle Biden-era censorship apparatus. One thing that you're repeatedly presented with is that the pieces of information that sort of the official censorship authorities decide is false, they often turn out to be true or they're just matters of opinion. So examples of things that I've seen discarded as false are things like the grooming gangs in England are predominantly Pakistani. That is true. COVID vaccines don't entirely prevent transmission. Guess what? That's true. COVID leaked from a lab, CIA assessed, that's true. There are average differences in IQ between racial groups. A lot of scientists say that's true. And let's see, what else? Certain claims about ballots in the 2020 election that turn out to be true, some sort is false. So this kind of provision you have to be very careful about.
Very true. And without questions from the audience, I will ask one more. How does the free speech campaigning abroad square with your approach, as your critics on the left might say, with your approach to immigration enforcement and protest?
So I think the answer is simple, which is that and people try to like allege hypocrisy by the American government here, but there's none. Every single person on American soil has the same First Amendment rights. We cannot, and the American government will not, enact a statute like the OSA that says, you can't post content online that causes negative emotions. At least you can't if you're an illegal immigrant. That would violate the First Amendment. So even illegal immigrants have First Amendment rights. The difference is that there's no First Amendment right. Nobody has the First Amendment right to be an invited guest on American soil as a foreign national. So when America chooses which guests to invite, we choose to invite people who don't despise the country or oppose its foreign policy in a detrimental way. The Trump administration isn't the first to do this. There's actually a Supreme Court case from 1971 involving visas for foreign communists that makes the same assessment.
Very interesting. Unless there are no more questions from the audience, I will adjourn there and say thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, Zia. Thank you to everyone.
Fabulous.